Hello and welcome. I'm Clint Berry with Superior Livestock Auction, and I'm joined again with Davey Jones from Ag Defense Risk Management, here talking a little bit about how to utilize the livestock gross margin tool for producers as a part of their risk management strategy. We would encourage you to go back and look. We've done 2 additional videos. This is the 3rd and final video. In the first one, we talked a little bit about the history and the mechanics of what LGM is. And in the second one, how to utilize LGM as a primary risk management strategy. And we'd like to dig a little deeper into how producers can now utilize LGM as a secondary risk management strategy in this series. So Davey, I'm going to turn it over to you and tell us a little bit about how to utilize that as a secondary piece within their overall risk management strategies.
Okay, yeah, I'm glad to do that, and this is I guess we've saved the best for last, because to me the topics we're going to talk about today are the ones that generate the most interest. They create the most flexibility. It's a point where you can use LGM as a secondary strategy in a number of ways, and I think that the vast majority of people who use it are probably going to find themselves in this camp, even though there are places that it comes in as a primary risk management strategy. Most of the time it will be a secondary or an accompanying method of protecting gross margins. So we'll kind of follow the same format as we did on the previous video. We'll talk about where it fits, where it doesn't fit. And so LGM as a secondary risk management tool fits well when added flexibility in handling futures positions is important. Okay. Now we could sit here probably for a couple of hours and come up with scenarios where a cattle feeder of his own accord or on the advice of their commodity broker have taken certain futures positions. And markets have changed such that those futures positions have value. And in many cases, that value looks temporary. It looks like markets are going to go back where they came from, so the temptation is, let's get out of these futures positions, take the money that we've made, so take our profits, and then we will reassume our positions when those markets go back where they came from. There's a lot of risk in doing that. But if you had purchased the LGM alongside futures contracts, then that creates some really unique advantages. So the first question most people would ask when hearing purchase both was, why in the world would I ever do that? So let's kind of address the question of why would you want to use LGM as a secondary risk management strategy alongside futures positions if they do the exact same thing. It seems like double expense, it seems like overkill, but I think in many scenarios it turns out to be just the opposite. We all know that when futures contracts pay off big, especially when you're talking about, as we've kind of defined and talked about in the past, the crush margins, when that relationship between the feeder cattle, the corn, and the feds turns against you, it's kind of Murphy's Law in full gear. It's not hardly ever enough to just get the payments from the futures positions when you get out of them in those years where the markets crash. It seems like it never stops all the bleeding, never covers all of the loss, and so you've got basis to contend with that isn't addressed with your hedge positions. Maybe you've got feed conversions that were poor. I mean, it just never seems to fail that when something goes wrong, everything goes wrong. So if a person could, they would double hedge everything. You'd take out 2 futures contracts. If you could afford to do that, but you can't afford to do that, it's not the commodity broker's fee that is restrictive there. It's the speculative risk that you take on if you double hedge. If it weren't for that speculative risk, I would venture to say most everyone would double, maybe even triple hedge, because when the markets go down, you need extra income to cover some of the losses that the hedges don't cover. So if you adopt as your risk management strategy to do both LGM and hedge just like you always have. What opportunities does that create? You get into a scenario where you have money made in your futures contracts, the decision to go ahead and take those profits becomes a lot easier, because your first thought is, I'm going to take these profits and I'm going to buy back in when the markets go back where they came from. Well, what if it doesn't happen? That's why we don't do that. What if they keep dropping? Well, your LGM is made to do the same thing your hedges was do. Your LGM is still in place even though you've taken your profit. And so you do still have downside protection and the opportunity to take your profit should you decide to do that.
That's a great point as to how the flexibility of adding LGM to your strategy can be beneficial.
Right. Now, the only risk in doing that at that point is, well, what if the markets keep going down? And then I would have had more protection if I had not, taken my profits over here. Well, you did get to take the vast majority of the profits that were there. You still had downside protection. I don't know that it really turns out a lot better or a lot worse, but you at least have another option.
At least it gives you the flexibility to make those decisions.
Sure. And then the other place that it works as a secondary strategy would be when the downside protection seems way more critical than the upside potential. So you come into a scenario where you're looking at the crush, you're looking at the margins that are available using the futures contracts, and it doesn't happen often, but you're elated with that. You just wish you could get your hands on more cattle, or there was more space in the feed yard, because you're now putting cattle in the feed yard that if everything that the futures contracts and the LGM don't protect you against turned out to be historical norms, you're set up to make good money. So at that point, it's not really the upside. The upside potential you might be locking yourself out of when you're locking in great margins becomes way less important. But then what is important is, well, what if that is what if that's a fairy tale ending outcome? What if the margins do shrink? My crush is going to protect me for what it can protect me for, but again, back to the Murphy's Law, it's that scenario where everything else that could go wrong probably will. So now you've got added protection in the downside markets. It's kind of like double insuring the downside. And you would only want to do that when you were happy with the upside that you're locking in. And so, again, that doesn't happen often, but there are times when the additional downside protection seems far more critical than the upside potential.
And the subsidy portion of LGM is what helps to deliver that kind of flexibility to the producer.
Right, good point, because we all know, and we'll kind of look at that as we talk individually, but it's important to constantly remind ourselves that LGM, regardless of how you use it, if it's used systematically, it will pay its own cost of being there. And so the LGM is adding that extra downside protection at a cost that if you just isolated the insurance by itself is going to be a net negative cost over time, actually a net income item versus a net expense item on your long-term cash flow.
Good point.
So having the confidence that while I may have to pay a premium in this year, if I look at it on a 5-year or 7-year or 10-year average, it's going to be contributing to the bottom line, not costing. And it's the subsidies, like you mentioned. It's
Great
the subsidies that make that possible. And then when capitalizing on profit-taking opportunities on hedge positions prior to selling fat cattle, or the fed cattle, is desired. So whether it's just the flexibility that you've got in the hedges themselves, or the opportunity to take the profit when it presents itself, or if it is double insuring the downside protection when the upside is a bed of roses, or at least appears to be. In each of those scenarios, it creates additional flexibility. For example, there are a lot of market scenarios where there is no reason to think, based on current market conditions, that you would make a profit or break even feeding cattle. Unfortunately, those conditions appear more often than we would like for them to. But there are people who feed cattle, no matter what that outlook looks like. And so let's talk about that scenario. You've got a market conditions that will not allow you to use futures markets and hedge in an expected profit. But you've also got the very real possibility that those cattle, instead of breaking even, could lose $200 or $300 a head. So you can't afford to take the downside risk of not hedging.
Right.
You don't want to lock yourself out of the upside potential that is there. And so your only hope is that those margins would improve. So you've got a limited number of things that you can do to manage risk in that scenario that really protect the downside but leave the upside potential open. So in that type of market condition, using it as a secondary would be using it as the primary source now, because you're putting LGM in place today to protect the downside. Your intention is that upside potential is going to appear at some point, and then I'm going to lock in that scenario with futures contracts when that opportunity presents itself. So instead of locking yourself out of the upside to protect the downside, or leaving the downside exposed in order to preserve the potential of the upside, or spend quite a bit of money using puts and calls to accomplish the same thing,
right,
then it becomes a good temporary step while waiting for better opportunities to present themselves to lock in with futures contracts.
Just added flexibility for a producer to choose.
Sure. Now the disadvantages, or where it wouldn't fit, I guess, not the disadvantages, but where LGM does not work as a secondary risk management strategy is when there is no primary risk strategy in place tied to fed cattle marketing dates. So kind of back to a point we talked about a little earlier, LGM as a secondary works pretty good as long as there's some other primary source of risk protection in place. So if your goal is to pool coverage to reduce premium risk, then you have no specifically timed coverage in place by some other method, then it becomes a poor option to even do that, as a secondary without a primary. So I guess you really don't have a secondary application where there's not a primary that exists. So you can't skip the primary and just use it as a secondary, I guess would be an easier way to state that. And if the premium in any given year would present a real financial hardship. So if you've been hedging, and in all of our calculations, we kind of just ignored the cost of hedging. It's a real cost, but we just kind of ignored it and called it a zero cost item because we wanted to give every advantage to the traditional way people have managed risk a chance to compete against the LGM. So we wanted to raise the bar for the LGM. But if you're not used to the potential of a premium being due at the end of a feeding period, and if that premium presents a financial hardship, then it's not a good move. You're getting a lot of things when you purchase an LGM contract, but you do have the potential of a premium cost. Sure. And so, as is the case with everything we do, we have to budget. And if LGM, even in the way you want to use it as a secondary risk strategy, if the premium becomes a financial hardship, then it's not a good fit. Now, there's ways to temper that premium, as we've talked about. You can minimize the premium by customizing your coverage. You can pool rates instead of non-pool them. You can take deductibles instead of taking no deductibles. So you can get there, and you can also remember that as you, especially in the deductible and subsidy portion, as you increase that deductible, which lowers the premium, you're also increasing your net return on premium invested over time. So there's a blessing and a curse in that. Sometimes avoiding that premium risk avoidance actually turns into increased return on investment. So the $70 per head deductibles will always yield a better rate of return on premium invested even though the zero deductible may return more gross or more net dollars, but it's still not going to be as good a return on investment. So there's a give and take in that.
Another great reason that it's important to have those individual one-on-one conversations with you and your team to see what best suits that producer's risk appetite, that producer's goals, and how it works best in their operation, in together with another primary risk management tool, or as an entity on its own, like we talked about in the first video.
Right. Yeah, and I think more so using it as the secondary risk. There are so many applications in this world that conversation really has to take on a operation specific nature to really nail down what is the right way to set up coverage, what are the right reasons for doing it one way versus the other.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, like we did in the second video when we were talking about it, using LGM as your secondary risk management strategy. Let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of that product.
Okay, yeah, let's do that, and we'll kind of keep it in the same kind of bullet point type format. Leveraging seasonal trends is most effective when LGM is implemented as a secondary plan. The reason being, you've got a primary plan that is targeting the months where you're actually marketing cattle.
Right.
And so you're looking at historical data that says, that LGM and gross margin losses follow a specific seasonal trend, then you can set your insurance up to cover the trend because you've got other coverage in place that's covering the targeted months that cattle are marketed.
Okay.
And so that makes it a huge advantage to use it as a secondary form of insurance or a secondary form of risk management. Having LGM in place as a supplement to futures contracts produces enormous value without speculative market risk. We kind of touched on that. It increases the times that it becomes extremely more beneficial and less risk inherent to take your profits,
right,
because you've got it in place as a secondary strategy. And then any arrangement of coverage, could it be expected to result in a net income over time because of the subsidies? We do keep bringing that up, but it is one of the major philosophies and major realities of crop insurance is that crop insurance used systematically because of subsidies becomes a self-supporting program and actually contributes to the bottom line. So I would say those three advantages are kind of the three key advantages of using it as a secondary. The disadvantages of using it as a secondary is that when it's used alongside futures contracts or delivery contracts, the upside potential remains limited.
Okay.
So if you use it as a secondary, you're probably using futures contracts as a primary. So depending on where the markets were when you put the coverage in place and took your steps to manage risk, that may be a perfectly acceptable thing. So it's not necessarily a bad or good thing. It's just a disadvantage is that you do limit the upside potential. When markets are near neutral, LGM can be an added expense. So if markets don't move much, you've got this expense that you never had before. Mm-hmm. But when the markets do move in future months or in future years, we know the long-term impact is going to be positive.
Right.
But a disadvantage is in a neutral market, it becomes an added expense. And you can, again, moderate that expense by how you set your coverage up and where you set your deductibles and the subsidies that follow. So, we haven't spent a lot of time going through any specific examples, but just in the generalizations, you can begin to see some real common themes. You can control your premium.
Yep.
You can expect it to pay over time. You can use it in multiple ways, and you can tailor it to do what you want it to do in and around what you're already doing in your operation.
That increased flexibility that this product brings to the table, to the arsenal for a cattle feeder, really makes a difference because it gives them that opportunity to tailor make that to each of their operations.
Exactly, and I think that becomes the real theme of what people need to bear in mind as they consider the possibility of looking more closely at livestock gross margin. We've got a ton of data. We've been kind of working on sample scenarios and really making sure that we understand what we're talking to our customers about when they confide in us. And so as we sit down to look at your operation specifically, or anybody that would call us to look at their operation all by itself in its own environment, then we have a ton of data that will help draw pictures of what they would expect the future to look like based on what the past has looked like in the program. So we've got scenarios that will compare using livestock gross margin as a secondary strategy compared to using just hedging.
Yep.
We've got scenarios of using it as the primary risk strategy compared to hedging. We have seasonal trends, what months have typically had the most recorded losses, paid the most claims on livestock gross margin, what expected gross margin in the beginning has normally ended up resulting in the largest number of claims or the largest degree of claims. So all of these data points that can be turned into pictures to help visualize how you're contemplating using LGM in addition to or in lieu of anything else you're doing become a real key in kind of keeping that discussion moving toward the end results that you would like for it to accomplish in your operation.
So it's nice to know that you and your team can provide some examples, because a lot of times that just helps drive home the point of how that would work in my operation when I can see how it did work in someone else's.
Yep.
So let's, just a few final thoughts as we wrap up here for producers to consider that you would like to drive home.
Okay. I think first and foremost is just a focus on the flexibility. This program provides valuable flexibility in futures trading and in the other types of risk management that you would like to incorporate or have incorporated in the past. So it can fit in a variety of ways, and to not discount its potential value just because it has a lot of moving parts. I'd say that probably is number one. The other thing is that even if you get to the point where you know how you want to use it, that may change, in different market conditions, because the same operation may use LGM differently from one month to the next, or one season to the next, or one market environment to the next. So it can change and move with what you need to do to adapt to changing conditions. Buying up the coverage level, we talked a little bit about this when we were talking about kind of the rigid numbers, like on the yearlings, the 750 pounds and the 50 bushel of corn and the 1,250 pound finished weight. The way you alter that is you have to sell 75% of the cattle that you insure to be eligible for the claims to be paid at 100%. As long as you do that, it's good. So if you think that those numbers are 10% light, you think that 750 pounds should be 8 1/4, and the 50 should be 55 bushels, and the 1,250 should be 1375. If you think they're 10% light, then you insure 10% more head than you're marketing, because if you sell 90% of what you insure, you're still above that 75%. So you could actually, if you knew for sure how many head you were going to sell, you could actually increase those numbers by 25% effectively. I wouldn't suggest crowding it that close, but I think 10 to 15, maybe as much as 20% increase in those numbers by upping the number of head that you insure can sure get you there and keep you safe with your 75%.
But that's a great strategy that goes back to, in the first video we talked a little bit about that concrete structure that those formulas were based on, and how to tailor that program, or tailor this program to fit your operation and what you're doing.
Yep, and there is a limit to that flexibility, because if you go below 75% marketed of your insured number of head, then you have a reduction in your claim, but you pay premium on 100% of the cattle. So there is a point where that flexibility goes away, and then it stings if you go past it. So as most programs are pretty good about doing, there's ways of limiting the flexibility in that respect. And then you've got seasonal trends that, I mean, goodness gracious, everybody gets charts in the mail and sees them on emails, and and paying attention to seasonal trends can be a very valuable thing to do. And so when you're using it as a secondary strategy, the implementing your coverage to where it can monopolize on and take advantage of those seasonal trends can be a very important thing to consider doing. And so again, don't discount the potential benefit of using it in a secondary strategy, even to the point of looking at those seasonal trends, which are very popular in terms of predicting what could happen or should happen in a normal year during certain times of the year. And I guess another thing I'd be really careful to point out is that even though we've had some time to talk about some of the flexible features of LGM, we've by no means covered all of them. This hasn't been an exhaustive study of the flexibility, but hopefully we've been able to kind of point out enough flexibility that producers and cattle feeders would say, I wonder if. Well, those are the kind of questions that we would need to visit about one-on-one, and we can kind of go down those roads. And then I guess saying it one final time, regardless of how you implement LGM, if it's used systematically in your operation because of subsidies, it could be expected to give you all this stuff that you could see from our discussion that could potentially be valuable at times, with a full expectation that over time it's going to pay its own way to get those things accomplished for you. And that is a really unique feature of crop insurance.
Thank you again for joining us today. We want to thank Davey for being here and encourage you, if you've got questions, hopefully we've sparked your interest about livestock gross margin and how that tool can be utilized in your operation to accomplish your risk management strategies. To learn more, contact Davey Jones at Ag Defense Risk Management to learn how livestock gross margin can fit into your operation.